So we'll just kick off with the webinar now. So thank you all very much for joining. You're very welcome today. We're going to take a half an hour look into the challenges associated with qualifying R&D in Ireland. And when we say qualifying R&D, what we mean by that is qualifying R&D from the perspective of RD&I funding and also R&D tax credits. So you're very welcome today. Just a couple of ground rules before we kick off. So we're recording this webinar. So if you could keep your video and your mic switched off during the call, that'd be great. And if you have any questions, please send them into the Zoom chat. And what we'll do is myself and Gerry will introduce ourselves now in a minute. We'll take 30 minutes to run through the webinar. And then at the end, we'll take approximately 10 minutes, depending on how many questions come in and how many comments come in, to answer those questions at the end. So firing in from the ReaDI-Watch team here is myself and Gerry. So just on the content for today's webinar, we're going to run through maximizing R&D and innovation incentives for your company. We're going to be looking at identifying what does qualifying R&D mean for my company. We're going to look at we're going to focus in on some different sectors during the course of the call. So we're going to look at engineering and construction. We're going to look at manufacturing and food production. And then we're also going to look at software later on in the session. But then in between that, we're going to talk about the importance of the company's RD&I framework for R&D funding and tax credits, but then also looking at the scientific and technological terminology and language to meet the R&D requirements. So as I said, you're all very welcome to the call again. And just for any newcomers coming in, if you could leave your video and your mic turned off. And then if you have any questions or comments, please send them into the Zoom chat. So just as a background and to kick off, where are we coming from? So we have the ReaDI-Watch digital platform. We're the ReaDI-Watch team, and you're very welcome today. We've built a digital platform for companies to manage their R&D work or their R&D activities in real time. So ReaDI-Watch streamlines, as in takes the cost out of and the time out of, and maximizes the impact of R&D. So looking at the area of R&D management, where do you look to for best practice? Because R&D and innovation, admittedly, they aren't as mature fields as, let's say, innovation management, or let's say, sorry, quality management or project management. But you'd look to some of the best practice guidance standards, such as the OECD Frascati manual, which we'll talk about, the new ISO Innovation Management Series, ISO 5602, and then also looking at IDA Ireland and Enterprise Ireland, the guidelines around those. So that's I suppose where we're coming from with this platform, and we'll give a bit of an overview of that at the end of the webinar as well. Just on myself, my name's David, and I'm the founder and CEO of ReaDI-Watch Limited. We just incorporated actually in 2021, so it's all very recent. But in GB Innovation with Gerry for 6 years, supporting small, medium and large Irish and also some international businesses to achieve R&D excellence. So looking at different sectors, which we'll talk about today, but like software, automation, food production, precision engineering, construction, and some other sectors. And basically in GB Innovation, I was the ReaDI-Watch project lead from 2016, and now we've incorporated in 2021 as a separate software as a service business. So that's myself, just very quickly. Over to you, Gerry.
I'll just come in there. So Gerry, Byrne is the name. I founded this company, GB Innovation, in 2014. The primary purpose to support companies and organizations in relation to their R&D management and also their innovation management. And what does excellence mean here and achieving excellence? So my own background is heavily industry oriented in R&D, coming from out of the German system, 10 years there, and working with larger corporations in my role as a professor of mechanical engineering in UCD. And then over my time as well in UCD, I've spent time working with the Enterprise Ireland on what was called the RTI committee for about 4 or 5 years. And then also for a good number of years as an expert on the panel of the Irish revenue in relation to the R&D tax credit. And one of the important things for me is the international aspect, the perspective on that, and then benchmarking against international best practice. So involvement with organizations like the Fraunhofer organization based in Germany, and with other organizations, national and international.
Great, thanks, Gerry. So myself and Gerry will be bouncing between each other for the webinar now as we go through the topics. So you'll hear from him again. So looking at R&D and innovation then. So what does that mean for my company? How can I identify and define it for my company? I suppose looking at R&D and innovation maybe as separate concepts. We'll bring that in later. But just for now, I suppose the two primary places where you might look to start would be the OECD Frascati manual. So the OECD is an organization of 36 countries, and 30 of them actually have adopted or have drawn upon the definitions for R&D as defined in the OECD's Frascati manual for defining research and development. And then on the right-hand side, we have the Enterprise Ireland definitions for research, development, and innovation, which is very useful as well. And so on the left, we have research and development, which is basically creative and systematic work undertaken in order to increase the stock of knowledge of humankind and to devise new applications of that available knowledge. So you see the terminology here coming in. It has to be creative. It must be systematic. And that has implications for the company, systematic being in a planned, structured manner. And I suppose the whole aim of R&D is to lift the body of knowledge in a field of science or technology. Looking at experimental development then, we've included this definition here just because it's most likely that if you're a company logging onto this call, you'll most likely be doing experimental development work. Now that, may vary, but that's most likely the case, which is also systematic work. So that planned, structured, well-documented manner, drawing on knowledge gained from research and practical experience. So both equally important, research and practical experience, to produce additional knowledge directed at producing new products or processes or improving existing products or processes. Looking at the Enterprise Ireland side then, there's a very useful document which we've included a link on there at the bottom. Research, development, and innovation is a continuous process of creating solutions, capturing the results, and then commercializing them in marketable products and services, thereby completing the innovation cycle. So for RD&I, I suppose there's a nice support system, there's a support ecosystem available in Ireland. And I suppose our position in ReaDI-Watch is that we feel that companies should be maximizing on those incentives and those supports that are available to them. So just as a flavor of those, of the types of incentives that are available, would be Enterprise Ireland RD&I grant aid to support a portion of the cost of undertaking in-company RD&I activity. And one of the examples of that type of a program would be the Disruptive Technologies Innovation Fund, which just this week, actually, the latest phase of that program actually moved to interview stage. So there's some companies that we've been involved with there. There's the R&D tax credit, which if you're logging into this call, most likely you'll have heard about. But it's a very, we'll get into the detail of that later, but it's a very good incentive for doing qualifying R&D work. And then finally, there's the knowledge development box, which is a little bit further down the road. It's basically, I suppose, a 50% reduction on corporation tax on profits attributable to intellectual property, which has resulted from R&D. So you do your R&D work, and then later on you can gain the knowledge development box, I suppose, incentive as well. And so just for the duration of this call, we have our own website linked up on the top right-hand side. And if you'd be interested in any further info on this, you can talk to, I suppose, myself or Gerry or anyone else on the team as a follow-up as well. Feel free to go into the website there and follow us up on that side. So looking then at RD&I, so I've mentioned that a few times now, research, development, and innovation. I suppose one thing I'd like to clarify on this call for people is what's the distinction between the two? How should I think about these two for the company and for my company? And one of the ways that I like to articulate this is by drawing on Michael Porter's company value chain. Michael Porter would be a pretty prominent kind of business strategy, kind of leading academic, I suppose, expert on the topic of business strategy. And he has a nice schematic here, which is Porter's company value chain, looking at all the activities that a company undertakes and the value that's created by doing those activities. And so he splits it out into primary activities, which is like operations, logistics, products and services, etc. And then there's supporting activities like infrastructure, HR, and procurement, etc. Now, I suppose one of the reasons that we feel that R&D management, the field of R&D management, isn't as well, I suppose, matured, let's say, as other areas, is because it's a supporting business activity. And we feel that it's couched in that technology development. So we feel that research and development is, I suppose, analogous to the development of technologies in a company. And when you're looking at R&D in your own company, you might consider research and development to be a supporting activity, I suppose, to guarantee your future success. But when you're thinking about innovation, there is indeed product and process innovation, which might fall into that technology development, but innovation is also across your business. And if you're looking at this, I suppose, value chain, you can pick all of those activities and innovate on them. But for R&D purposes, we like to see it in the technology development. Another way to look at it is an interesting study that was done by Dublin. So they have their 10 types of innovation, would be a pretty reputable source for innovation management. And looking across the top, you can see the 10 different types of innovation, from business model innovation all the way over to customer experience innovation. One of the interesting insights from this survey that they did was if they looked at the volume of innovation efforts, so i.e. the investment that's gone into innovation across companies, and they see that product performance and product system in your offering is where the majority of the investment went. But actually, when you look at the value that was actually derived from that innovation work, the value creation mostly came from business model innovation and networking innovation and maybe customer experience innovation. When it came to the product and process performance and the system, which we would consider more around the technology development, more like R&D, less than 2% of the project produced more than 90% of the value. So the ability to pick the right projects for R&D and innovation purposes is absolutely key for a company looking to create value out of their R&D and innovation work, which is a challenge, of course, for any senior manager looking in at choosing what to do next with R&D. Again, looking at R&D then and distinguishing R&D in your company from qualifying R&D. So we mentioned technology development as being kind of analogous to R&D. But when you're thinking about R&D tax incentives and potentially also international R&D type grants, if you're defining R&D in your company from a qualifying perspective, it has to be in the lifting of the body of knowledge in a field of science or technology. So you might have your existing technologies in your business, you might have your existing products and services. And then for R&D to be qualifying, what you must demonstrate is that by doing this work, you're lifting the body of knowledge beyond the known state of the art in a field of science or technology. So if you can see here along the middle line there, we have the current level of knowledge in the field of science or technology. That would be defined as the state of the art. And what you're trying to do is move the work or move your knowledge beyond that. So lifting the body of knowledge. So thinking back to those earlier definitions of R&D that we saw from the OECD's Frascati manual, it's all about lifting the body of knowledge. So I'll pass over to Gerry there for a sec, just to, I suppose, focus in on the engineering and construction sectors.
We're just starting to look at a couple of the industry sector focuses, foci, and you see this one here is engineering and construction. And within engineering and construction, we can see almost on a daily basis the rapidity of the innovation and the disruption that's taking place. So there is really rapid transformation driven for a whole lot of reasons, not least the digitalization and the move to artificial intelligence and so on, but also because an underlying point is that the different disciplines, both within engineering and beyond, they're converging. So there is a convergence happening here. So the traditional civil engineer versus the traditional mechanical or electrical or the software engineer, they're converging now into the systems. And that's a major driver. So civil engineering now, and these reports here are just indicating some recent studies that were undertaken, some of them being strongly led by KPMG. And so these reports show that the construction sector here is moving towards modularization, that a significant percentage of work now would be off-site, and there's an increasing amount of on-site assembly. So that off-site work basically means that products will be produced, manufactured away in more traditional type factories away from the site. And then many of the questions that arise in advanced manufacturing, for example, the speed of turnaround, the supply chain and the challenges with supply chain, many of these issues being addressed already in the automotive, in the medical device sector, for example. Now, modularization is happening in the construction sector. So, and this is facilitated, as I mentioned, through BIM and through digitalization, and these are drivers there. So significant developments and disruptive innovations happening and having to happen for Ireland to be in a competitive situation in these sectors.
Lovely, thanks, Gerry. And I suppose one of the positions that we like to, or one of the takeaways we'd like you to take from this webinar is that investing in R&D in a time of such transformation and disruption, it might seem like the natural conclusion to be kind of a follower and to see where the trends go and then invest. But in fact, what we see is that investing in R&D innovation during these times is actually what ensures sustained competitive advantage. So if you're in the construction sector, looking at those areas like BIM, modularization, etc., they're very relevant, very topical, and definitely from a qualifying R&D perspective, there's something that you should be looking at from an incentives point of view. So from your funding and also your R&D tax credits. Dipping back out then from the industrial sector focus of construction, looking at Enterprise Ireland and the R&D tax credit then. So as we mentioned, Enterprise Ireland looking at RD&I and then the tax credit focusing more specifically on research and development. Just, I suppose, as a flavor, as an indication to how these, I suppose, grant funded activities work versus the tax credit. The grant funding type of activity, you apply in advance. You know whether you've gotten approved before you actually make your investment. And so it's quite a proactive approach, but also, I suppose, you could argue as well, leaving some inflexibility compared to the tax credit regime. So you need to know in advance and you make your application. On the other side, the R&D tax credit, then you, I suppose, are more flexible in the sense that you can just expend during the year on R&D. And then at the end of the financial year or after the financial year, you make your R&D tax credit claim. What we see for companies, I suppose the message that we'd like you to take away here is that if you're managing both of these activities proactively and in real time, that's the approach which is going to get you, I suppose, the best return on your R&D investment. So those are the two different types of I suppose, the grant funding versus the R&D tax credits. And an interesting survey that the IRDG actually undertook, the IRDG being the Irish Research and Development Group led by Dennis Hayes, a great group for sharing knowledge around R&D and innovation in Ireland. And in this study, actually, they showed that they reviewed or they got a survey of 220 companies across different industry sectors in Ireland. They actually found that 57% of those companies that were surveyed actually used a combination of R&D tax credits and grant supports on specific business projects. So if you have a business project, you might get 50% grant funding for that project, let's say. But if that also meets the requirements for qualifying R&D from the tax credit percentage, the remaining part or the expenditure that you've incurred yourself, that actually might be eligible as qualifying R&D for tax credit purposes. So if you spend 100,000 and you get 50,000 back from an Enterprise Ireland grant funding perspective, the other 50,000 may be eligible from a qualifying R&D perspective. And so you can get your 25 or 30% back on that part as well. So interesting that a lot of the IRDG surveyed companies actually went down that route. And that's something to consider for your business. Don't think of them mutually exclusively. If you're making investments, try to maximize on both types of incentives that are available. Moving on then to the another industry sector focus in manufacturing and food production. So starting with food production, I suppose some of the emerging trends that are coming out that you'll see across the sector is in the area of sustainable packaging. So as aligned to the UN sustainability goals and the European Green Deal, etc. I suppose improvements or enhancements in process technology, the rise of wellness and plant-based, etc., and obviously Industry 4. And I suppose the key challenge for qualifying R&D, if you're going into this call from a food production setting, is being very, very clear about what NPD is, so new product development in my business, versus research and development. And you might draw on the definitions that we drew on earlier in the call, in that lifting the body of knowledge, looking at the technological developments that you're making when you're just trying to distinguish between new product development and research and development. And then over to you, Gerry, for manufacturing.
I'll just pick up on the right-hand side of the slide there shows manufacturing. And just very briefly, interesting to note that, let's say the last 5 years has seen tremendous developments in Ireland in relation to R&D, both in the industrial side and also in the academic side. So for example, there's new centres now, the Confirm Centre, which is a Science Innovation Ireland Centre, the IFORM Centre for Advanced Manufacturing as well. Irish Manufacturing Research is another more applied research centre, and then possibly in the future an IDA centre. So there's been great investment in the ecosystem for R&D. But then it's one of the key challenges that these types of companies face in this area is, what is qualifying R&D? And it's very, very important to recognize that a distinction needs to be made between engineering, between design, and between R&D. And there's subtleties in there that can be quite challenging. So that's one of the key challenges. But within manufacturing, there's a huge opportunity as well for incentives through the grants, Enterprise Ireland, and then IDA, and then also through the EU grants coming up in the Horizon Europe. So I just
perfect. Thanks, Gerry. So as an example of a manufacturing company that has really considered innovation central to its success would be a company that we're working with called CompuLift. They'd be a fantastic forklift manufacturer based up in Monaghan in Ireland. And even you can see under their logo, lifting innovation is actually central to the company. And if you just look at Martin McVicker's comments here, he would be the co-founder and the CEO of the company. He says, rapid innovation and minimal time to market is a major driver for CompuLift's commercial success as the world's fastest growing forklift vehicle manufacturer. So looking at that rapid innovation in the manufacturing setting is crucially important to the sustained competitive advantage of that business. Dipping back out then of the industry sectors and looking at specifically at the R&D tax credit, drawing again upon this interesting survey that the IRDG carried out in 2018, which showed 220 companies that were surveyed. Interestingly, of those that submitted for an R&D tax credit that year, 50% of them actually had some sort of intervention, whether that be a desk audit, I suppose a science test technical audit, or just simply an aspect query letter from the revenue commissioners. So it really shows that, I suppose, that what we're trying to bring across here is that if you're claiming for the R&D tax credit, you should be trying to be prepared as if you're ready for audit as you go. So I suppose our key message here would be, if you're managing your R&D in real time, proactively getting your staff to document the activities in a manner that meets the requirements, that's fundamentally important, and that you've made a decision gate in your company before a project kicks off, that this project will be R&D, and that the staff involved with that project will be aware of that distinction, and they'll know I'm working now on an R&D project. So that's, I suppose, something we want to bring across just on the tax credit side of things. Looking then back into the industry sectors, looking at software, and this is our last industry sector for today. But obviously software as a sector moves very rapidly. So there's agile development philosophies in place, and as such, there's rapid advances, Moore's law, etc., etc. When you're looking at qualifying R&D in the software sector, it's admittedly that, it's well recognized that it can be kind of tricky to distinguish qualifying R&D from other software type development activities. And so some typical areas where those advancements might be found that are actually deemed to be qualifying R&D are listed up here on the top left here. So something like data modeling, game development, enhancing the scalability of cloud application, machine learning, automation, AI. Now, from our perspective, I suppose we would consider ourselves experts in the science test. So the question of qualifying R&D from the science or technological perspective. And one of the tests that we do when we, look at a software type project is we say, and this goes across the board for any other type of project, going from our earlier discussion where we showed R&D versus non-R&D as lifting the body of knowledge beyond the state of the art. Well, you need to establish what is the state of the art. What is the current level of knowledge in this field of science or technology that I'm working in? And then I suppose you have your technological uncertainties, which is another requirement from a tax credit perspective. But then you have your technological advancements, and your advancements is the targeted outcome of your work. And that targeted outcome needs to be beyond the known state of the art in the field of science or technology. So some, advancements that might seem, qualifying in the software, in that industry sector. There's some examples here. So there might be an advancement in the development of mathematical models or algorithms to achieve desired functionality goals, translating models or algorithms into code, ensuring that the application or the process or the tool developed will function across a range of platforms, and ensuring that the application or process or tool developed will integrate it as intended with other applications or systems. So equally in the software sector, it's important to distinguish at the beginning, is this project qualifying R&D or not? And if there's tax credits being claimed, all of those R&D tax credit requirements must be met as you go through the financial year. So looking at a case study from a software perspective then, we work closely with a company called Anum Technologies, who are a world-leading SMS firewall and HTTP monetization service provider who filter billions of messages and eliminate fraud and spam. And in Anum, I suppose this quote from Noel Kelly, the CEO from Anum, actually it captures very well the essence of what we're trying to bring across in companies for R&D and innovation. They could be considered best in class from this perspective. Would be, we have best in class structures and processes in place for R&D and innovation. So R&D and innovation, and place a great emphasis on the culture and appetite in the company for R&D and innovation. Innovation and R&D are well-defined concepts which translate into clearly communicated initiatives in Anum. All of our staff contribute to innovation and R&D. So some of the key things to take away from this would be having a culture and an appetite in the company for R&D and innovation. And I suppose what we mean by that is that your staff understand what is and isn't R&D in your company, and they have a culture, and there's a culture for reporting there and an appetite for innovating. And then also having that translated into clearly communicated innovation initiatives. For example, there might be an ideation effort, there might be a revision to your marketing innovation. Having that well defined in your company is central to the success. So that's, I suppose, a snapshot through different industrial sectors, through a little bit of the background, I suppose, on the Enterprise Ireland grant funding, the R&D tax credits, and some of the management theory on how to distinguish those in your company. And so we at ReaDI-Watch, I suppose, what we're trying to do is to streamline and maximize the impact of that in companies. So we have our digital platform, which is called ReaDI-Watch. And I'm just going to take a quick flash through the platform just to give you a flavor. You won't get much out of this now, but you just get a flavor of what it looks like and what it feels like, just to see how we're getting companies to manage their R&D efforts in real time. So, I'm sorry, play this. So it's just a short video here. So here we have our platform. It's a cloud-based platform, and we have a list of projects here that are being developed by a company. So we've clicked into a project, and this is a project that has been filled out by a company in real time over the course of the year. And following the menu on the left-hand side, they're meeting all of the requirements for their R&D&I incentives as they work. So they have their work packages here, their investigative work that they're recording. So as they go, they're following best practice, and the staff understand when it's R&D, I need to be logging into ReaDI-Watch and recording my activities. Off the back of that, you see a summary technical report automatically gets populated that can be used for, grant funding purposes or R&D tax credit purposes at the end of the financial year or whenever it's needed. And that's just a very quick flash to give you a flavor of how ReaDI-Watch works and embodies the principles that we're trying to bring across here. ReaDI-Watch, I suppose, as a digital platform is the core offering of our business. We're a software as a service business, but also to help companies along and to get to grips with R&D and also to manage it in the best way possible. We have a couple of other services around that. So we have a training program for research and development, which we feel is important for staff and executives alike to understand the requirements for qualifying R&D and then also how to manage it as you go. We have a test that we can run, which we alluded to earlier in the software industry, but the opinion where we provide an independent opinion on whether an activity meets the requirements for qualifying R&D or not. Having that independent opinion in an audit or in an appeal circumstance for a company can be quite useful for them to draw upon, and we consider ourselves, I suppose, science test, let's say, experts. We have a management model called the core technologies approach or core technologies management model. And as you can imagine, it's a method for contextualizing the work that you're doing in a company from an R&D and innovation standpoint, also making robust these R&D tax credit claims, looking at the technologies being advanced. And then fundamentally, we have our research readiness level assessment. And that's actually why we've named the product and the company ReaDI-Watch. what we're looking at is RD&I, but we're also trying to get companies ready for RD&I excellence. So on our RRL chart, which is called the Research Readiness Level Assessment chart, what we basically do is we try to bring companies from the bottom left-hand side up to the top right-hand side to be ready for RD&I excellence. So I'm just going to close off with a final slide here, just on some key takeaways from the webinar today. I suppose from the perspective as well of meeting qualifying R&D requirements. There's a strong business case for undertaking research, development, and innovation as part of your company's overall strategy. Even in a time of significant disruption, as we're seeing in the construction sector, it's good to invest to ensure your own sustained competitive advantage. Innovation is broader in scope than R&D, but does include R&D. You could say R&D falls within innovation, but there is a value add of innovations across your company, not just in your product and process. If you're considering investing, consider across the board. There's considerable governance support available, which is fantastic, which is a fantastic incentive to undertake RD&I, both from the EI standpoint, if you're a larger company from the IDA perspective, or sorry, from an FDI perspective, the IDA are there as well. But then on the other side, there's the revenue, I suppose, the revenue implemented scheme, which is the R&D tax credit from the Department of Finance. But then from our side, what we would recommend to companies that are leaving this webinar now is to follow best practice. You do so in all of your other business processes, and R&D should be considered a business process, which is to be optimized. So follow best practice. Clearly distinguish R&D in your company and follow a lean, as in taking the time and cost out, real-time R&D business process to maximize its impact. So thank you very much for attending this webinar. It's very much appreciated. If you have any follow-up questions, you can contact me directly or through the website. You can click book a demo and we can do a 30-minute call. No obligations needed, just to hear your case. And then what I'll do now is I'm going to leave this slide up and I'm going to check the Zoom chat for any messages. So if you don't have any questions, thanks very much for attending, and we'll leave it there. But we'll take this time now for another few minutes just to answer any questions that might have come in during the call.